Tomorrow would bring another routine patrol, another day of whispered comments and sideways glances. But something had shifted in that brief conversation with Santos. For the first time, Rebecca found herself wondering if there might be a way to bridge the gap between who she was and who they needed her to be. She just didn't know yet that the opportunity would come sooner than anyone expected, and in a way that would reveal the true nature of her unusual calm. The rumors started during Rebecca's 4th week at Edwards, but by her 2nd month, they had crystallized into something much more dangerous than casual gossip. Lieutenant Jackson had elevated his campaign from whispered comments to open challenges, and Colonel Barrett's growing unease had begun manifesting in ways that threatened to derail Rebecca's career entirely. It began with the incident reports. Rebecca discovered the first one by accident, catching sight of her name on Barrett's desk during a routine briefing update. The document was titled Unusual Behavioral Patterns, LT, Rebecca Davis, and contained detailed observations of her abnormal stress responses and concerning lack of emotional range. What made it worse was the recommendation at the bottom: suggest psychological reevaluation and potential reassignment to non-combat roles. Lieutenant Davis, Barrett's voice cut through her concentration, and she realized she'd been staring at the document for several seconds. Is there something you need? No, sir. Just waiting for the weather update you requested. Barrett's eyes followed her gaze to the report, and his expression hardened slightly. I'll have that for you in a moment. As Rebecca left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that her time at Edwards was running out. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being pushed out not for poor performance, but for performing too well while looking like she didn't care. The situation escalated 3 days later during a squadron training exercise. The simulation involved a mock dogfight scenario, with pilots paired off in combat situations designed to test their reaction times and tactical decision-making under pressure. Rebecca was paired with Jackson, a matchup that felt deliberately provocative. Try to keep up, robot, Jackson muttered over the comm as they entered the simulated airspace. His usual swagger was amplified by the audience of other pilots observing from the control room. What happened next became legendary among the squadron, though not for the reasons Jackson intended. Rebecca's performance in the simulator was flawless, not just good, but perfect. She anticipated Jackson's every move, countered his tactics before he fully executed them, and maintained her calm demeanor, even as the G-forces in the simulator would have left most pilots gasping. But it was her final maneuver that left everyone speechless. As Jackson attempted a high-risk attack run, Rebecca executed a defensive pattern so precise and unexpected that she not only avoided his targeting solution, but positioned herself for a kill shot that would have been impossible for most human pilots to calculate in real time. Simulation terminated. Came the announcement from the control booth. Winner, Lieutenant Davis. Jackson climbed out of his simulator pod, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. Around him, other pilots stared at the tactical replay in stunned silence. The maneuver Rebecca had just performed was theoretically possible, but required reaction times and spatial calculation abilities that pushed the boundaries of human capability. That's not normal, Jackson announced to the room, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. Nobody flies like that. It's like she's not even human. This time, Rebecca was standing close enough to hear every word, and for the first time since her arrival, her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the faintest edge. My performance parameters are within acceptable ranges for combat operations. Acceptable? Jackson stepped closer, emboldened by the audience. That was like watching a computer program. Real pilots make mistakes, have off days, show some kind of human reaction. You're like a machine pretending to be a person." The room fell completely silent. Even the maintenance crew working nearby had stopped their activities to listen. Rebecca stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on Jackson with an intensity that made several pilots shift uncomfortably. "I am exactly what this squadron needs," she said quietly. "A pilot who doesn't let emotions compromise mission effectiveness." "What we need," Jackson shot back, "is someone we can trust. How can we rely on you in combat if we don't even know if you're capable of caring whether we live or die?" Before Rebecca could respond, Santos stepped forward from the back of the group. His voice was calm but carried the authority of his years and rank. "That's enough, Jackson. Lieutenant Davis' performance speaks for itself. Does it?" Jackson turned to face the older pilot. "Because from where I'm standing, it speaks to someone who's so disconnected from reality that she can't even pretend to be human around her own squadron." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Rebecca's face remained impassive, but something in her eyes suggested the impact had gone deeper than anyone realized. Without another word, she gathered her flight gear and walked out of the room, her stride as measured and controlled as always. Santos watched her go, then turned. Back to Jackson. "You're out of line, Lieutenant. Am I? Or am I the only one willing to say what everyone's thinking?" Looking around the room, Santos saw the uncomfortable expressions, the sideways glances, the reluctant nods. Jackson wasn't entirely wrong. Rebecca's behavior did unnerve people. But his instincts told him there was more to the story than any of them understood. That evening, Santos found Rebecca in the hangar, running diagnostics on her aircraft with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The maintenance crew had gone home hours ago, leaving the vast space empty except for the two of them and the rows of silent jets. "You don't have to prove anything to Jackson," he said, approaching her workstation. Rebecca didn't look up from her tablet. "I am not attempting to prove anything. I am ensuring my aircraft is mission ready at 11 p.m. when your next flight isn't scheduled until Thursday." For the first time, Rebecca's hands paused in their movement across the diagnostic interface. "I find the work calming." Santos pulled up a maintenance stool and sat down beside her. "You know, in 20 years of flying, I've learned that the pilots who seem the most different are often the ones who understand flying the best. The question is whether they understand people." "I do not understand people," Rebecca admitted, her voice so quiet Santos had to lean closer to hear her. "I understand systems, patterns, probabilities. People are inconsistent. That's what makes us human." Rebecca finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "What if being human is not compatible with being the best pilot I can be?" The question caught Santos off guard. There was something vulnerable in it, a crack in the armor that revealed depths he hadn't suspected. "What do you mean?" Rebecca set down her tablet and turned to face him fully. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing whether to trust him with something significant. "When I fly, everything becomes clear. Time slows down, patterns emerge, solutions become obvious. But when I'm on the ground, interacting with the squadron ... She paused, searching for words. "It's like trying to solve an equation where all the variables keep changing." Santos began to understand. "You process stress differently than the rest of us." "I process everything differently. Fear, pressure, uncertainty, they don't cloud my judgment, they sharpen it. But that makes me ... incompatible with normal human social dynamics." Before Santos could respond, footsteps echoed across the hangar floor. Colonel Barrett approached, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting. "Lieutenant Davis, Captain Santos. Working late?" "Just finishing diagnostics, sir," Rebecca replied, immediately returning to her formal posture. Barrett's eyes moved between them, assessing. "Davis, I need to speak with you." "My office, tomorrow morning at 0800. Yes, sir. As Barrett walked away, Santos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The colonel's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a routine meeting. "Rebecca," Santos said quietly, using her first name for the first time. "Whatever's happening, you're not alone in this." She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you, Santos. But some battles can only be fought alone." The next morning, Rebecca sat in Colonel Barrett's office, her posture perfect, despite the storm she sensed approaching. Barrett studied her across his desk, a thick folder open between them. "Lieutenant, I've been reviewing your performance. Records, psychological evaluations, and incident reports from your previous assignments." He turned the folder so she could see the contents. "There's a pattern here that concerns me." Rebecca remained silent, waiting. Exceptional technical performance coupled with persistent integration challenges. Your previous commanding officers all note the same issues: inability to form team bonds, unusual stress responses, behavior that makes other pilots uncomfortable. My mission performance has never been questioned, sir. No, it hasn't. But combat isn't just about individual performance. It's about trust, teamwork, the ability to function as part of a unit. Your squadron mates need to know they can rely on you, not just as a pilot, but as a person. Barrett leaned back in his chair. "I'm recommending you for a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Depending on the results, we may need to consider whether combat aviation is the right fit for your particular ... skill set." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, though her expression remained unchanged. Everything she had worked for, everything she was being questioned because she was exceptional in ways that made others uncomfortable. "With respect, sir, my psychological profile was thoroughly evaluated before my assignment here. My clearance is current. Psychological profiles can miss things, Lieutenant. Sometimes it takes field observation to identify potential issues." Rebecca felt something shift inside her. Not panic, not fear, but a cold, calculating clarity that she recognized as her true nature asserting itself. "What exactly is the issue you've identified, sir?" Barrett hesitated. How could he explain that her competence felt threatening, that her calm seemed inhuman, that her very presence made seasoned combat pilots question their own humanity? "The issue, Lieutenant, is that I can't predict how you'll react under real pressure. And in combat, unpredictability gets people killed." Rebecca stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Barrett nodded. "You're concerned about unpredictability, but what you're really afraid of is predictability. You're afraid that when the moment comes, I'll do exactly what needs to be done, regardless of what anyone expects or wants. You're afraid that I might be better at this than anyone you've ever commanded." The room fell silent. Barrett stared at her, recognizing something in her voice he'd never heard before. Not emotion, exactly, but a kind of crystalline certainty that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. "The evaluation is scheduled for next week," he said finally. "Dismissed." As Rebecca left his office, Barrett couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. What he didn't know was that Rebecca Davis was about to face a situation that would reveal the true nature of her unusual abilities and force everyone around her to confront their assumptions about what it meant to be human in the face of impossible odds. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for Tuesday morning. By Monday evening, word had spread through the squadron like wildfire, and Rebecca found herself more isolated than ever. The other pilots didn't know the specific details, but they understood the implications. Their commanding officer had serious enough doubts about one of their own to order a complete mental health assessment. Lieutenant Jackson couldn't hide his satisfaction. "About time," he commented loudly in the mess hall. "Some of us have been saying this for months." You can't trust someone who doesn't react like a normal person. Rebecca sat at her usual table, methodically eating her dinner while pretending not to hear the conversation swirling around her. But something was different tonight. The mechanical precision of her movements seemed more pronounced, as if she were retreating further into the rigid patterns that gave her comfort. Santos watched her from across the room, noting the subtle changes in her posture. He'd seen pilots crack under pressure before, but Rebecca's response was unlike anything in his experience. Instead of breaking down, she seemed to be crystallizing, becoming more herself in ways that made her even more alien to those around her. "I heard Barrett's got her scheduled for a full psych workup," whispered Lieutenant Angela Foster, a newer pilot who'd arrived just weeks after Rebecca. "Think she wash out?" "Hard to say," replied her wingman, Lieutenant Mark Williams. "She's technically sound, but there's definitely something off about her. I've never seen anyone stay that calm during emergency simulations." Rebecca's hearing was acute enough to catch every word, each comment adding another layer to the pressure building inside her. But rather than breaking her down, the hostility was having an unexpected effect. It was clarifying her purpose, sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. That night, alone in her quarters, Rebecca sat at her desk, staring at the psychological evaluation paperwork she'd been given to complete. The questions were invasive, probing, designed to uncover hidden instabilities or antisocial tendencies. Each one felt like an interrogation of her fundamental nature. Describe your emotional response to high-stress situations. Rebecca stared at the question for a long time before writing. Stress enhances cognitive function and situational awareness. Emotional responses are secondary to tactical requirements. How do you relate to your fellow service members? Another. Pause. I respect their capabilities and rely on their professional competence. Personal relationships are not relevant to mission success. The questions continued, each one feeling like a trap designed to prove she was unfit for the career she devoted her life to. By the time she finished, Rebecca felt something she rarely experienced: uncertainty about her future. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Intelligence had detected unusual activity in the northern sectors, and Colonel Barrett was forced to postpone several routine missions to focus resources on reconnaissance. Rebecca's Eastern Border Patrol was among the canceled flights. All pilots report to the briefing room, came the announcement over the base's communication system. Priority intelligence update. Rebecca entered the briefing room to find it buzzing with nervous energy. The large display screen showed satellite imagery of the disputed northern territories, marked with red indicators showing suspected enemy movements. Colonel Barrett stood at the front, his expression grim. Intelligence reports significant force buildup in sectors 6 and 7. We're looking at potentially the largest enemy presence in this region in over 2 years. Captain Rivara stepped forward with detailed assignments. Alpha Team will conduct long-range reconnaissance. Bravo Team will provide overwatch and support. Charlie Team. He paused, glancing at Barrett before continuing. Charlie Team will maintain defensive positions at base. Rebecca understood immediately. Charlie Team was her assignment. She was being kept on the ground, excluded from the most critical mission the squadron had faced in months. The psychological evaluation had already effectively grounded her, even before it had been completed. Jackson couldn't resist commenting. Smart call. This is real combat, not simulator games. Something inside Rebecca snapped, not visibly, not emotionally, but with the crystalline precision of a perfectly calibrated instrument, finally reaching its breaking point. She stood, her movement so fluid and controlled that it drew every eye in the room. "Colonel Barrett," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I request permission to speak." Barrett hesitated. "Lieutenant, now isn't the time," With respect, sir, this is exactly the time. Rebecca stepped forward, her dark eyes fixed on the satellite imagery. The reconnaissance pattern you're planning has a significant tactical vulnerability. Lieutenant Davis, return. To your seat. That's an order. Rebecca didn't move. Instead, she continued analyzing the displayed intelligence with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The enemy positions form a defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire. The approach vectors you've selected will expose our aircraft to coordinated surface-to-air missile attacks. I said return to your seat, Lieutenant. The optimal approach would be from the eastern ridge, using terrain masking to avoid their primary sensor arrays. A single reconnaissance aircraft could penetrate their defensive screen and provide tactical intelligence without exposing multiple assets to hostile fire. Barrett's face darkened. Lieutenant Davis, you are out of line. Security, escort Lieutenant Davis from the briefing room. As two military police officers moved toward her, Rebecca remained perfectly still. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried a strange quality, not louder, but somehow more present, more commanding than before. You're going to send 12 pilots into a kill zone because you're afraid of what I might do if you trust me with the mission I'm trained for. The room fell absolutely silent. Even the MPs paused, unsure whether they were witnessing insubordination or something else entirely. Santos stood up from his seat. Colonel, maybe we should hear her out. Captain Santos, this is not a democracy. Lieutenant Davis is clearly exhibiting the kind of unpredictable behavior that justifies my concerns about her psychological fitness. Rebecca turned to face Barrett directly, her expression unchanged, but her presence somehow more intense than anyone had ever seen it. Colonel, my behavior is not unpredictable. It's optimized. The difference is that optimization doesn't always look like what you expect from human emotion. That's exactly the problem, Lieutenant. You don't react like a human? Rebecca interrupted, her voice cutting through his words with surgical precision. You're right, sir. When lives are at stake, when missions hang in the balance, when split-second decisions determine who lives and who dies in those moments, I don't react like most humans. I react like someone who values mission success over personal comfort. I react like someone who processes fear and uncertainty as tactical data rather than emotional noise. Barrett stared at her, recognizing something in her tone that he'd never heard before. This wasn't the emotionless robot his squadron had dismissed. This was something far more dangerous, a predator awakening to the full extent of its capabilities. You want to ground me because I'm too calm, too precise, too focused on the mission. But what you're really afraid of is that when the moment comes, I'll do exactly what needs to be done, regardless of protocol, regardless of expectations, regardless of what makes you comfortable. Rebecca took a step closer to the tactical display, her finger tracing the enemy positions with unerring accuracy. You're about to send good pilots into a situation that requires perfect execution under impossible conditions. And you're doing it without your most capable asset, because that asset makes you nervous. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Every pilot, every officer, every enlisted person present was witnessing something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of military hierarchy, but not in the way anyone had expected. Security, I want Lieutenant Davis confined to quarters pending her psychological evaluation, Barrett ordered, his voice tight with controlled anger. As the MPs moved toward her again, Rebecca did something that shocked everyone present. She smiled not broadly, not warmly, but with a cold, crystalline precision that somehow conveyed absolute confidence. Yes, sir. But Colonel, when this mission goes wrong, and it will go wrong, remember that you had a solution standing right in front of you. You just couldn't see past your own fear to recognize it. As the military police escorted her from the room, Rebecca's parting words echoed in the stunned silence. Fear is a choice, Colonel. Some of us choose differently. Santos watched her go, his mind racing. He'd seen combat pilots under pressure, witnessed breakdowns and breakthroughs, but Rebecca's transformation was unlike anything in his experience. She hadn't broken down. She'd crystallized into something harder, more focused, more dangerous than before. Colonel, Santos said quietly, maybe we should reconsider. The decision is made, Captain. Lieutenant Davis has proven my point better than any psychological evaluation could. But as Barrett turned back to the mission planning, he couldn't shake Rebecca's words. Her analysis of the tactical situation had been flawless, her assessment of the risks accurate. The question that haunted him was whether his judgment was being clouded by his discomfort with her unusual nature. In her quarters, Rebecca sat calmly at her desk, writing in a notebook with the same precise movements she'd always used. But the words she was writing were different. Not technical reports or mission notes, but something else entirely. She was documenting every detail of her treatment, every slight, every decision that had led to this moment. Because Rebecca Davis had learned something important from her confrontation with Barrett. The system wasn't interested in optimization or capability. It was interested in comfort, in predictability, in the reassurance that came from working with people who fit expected patterns. But combat didn't care about comfort. Combat rewarded capability, precision, and the willingness to do what others couldn't or wouldn't do. And Rebecca was beginning to understand that if the system wouldn't allow her to prove her worth through normal channels, she would have to find another way. The psychological evaluation was still scheduled for the next morning. But Rebecca was no longer approaching it as a test to pass. She was approaching it as intelligence gathering, an opportunity to understand exactly what the system feared about her, and how she could use that fear to her advantage. Because Lieutenant Rebecca Davis had reached her breaking point, and instead of breaking, she had become something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The psychological evaluation took place in a sterile conference room in the base's medical facility. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a civilian contractor with 20 years of experience evaluating military personnel, sat across from Rebecca with a thick file spread before her. What she expected was a breakdown, defensiveness, or at least some sign of the emotional instability that had triggered this evaluation. What she got was something entirely different. Lieutenant Davis, I've reviewed your file and the incidents that led to this evaluation. Would you like to tell me your perspective on recent events? Rebecca sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on a point just over Dr. Hoffman's shoulder. My perspective is that this evaluation represents a systematic failure to distinguish between optimal performance and normative behavior patterns. Dr. Hoffman blinked. In 2 decades of evaluations, no one had ever opened with a clinical analysis of the evaluation process itself. Can you elaborate on that? Military aviation demands peak performance under extreme stress. The psychological profiles used to evaluate pilots are based on statistical norms derived from average performers. By definition, exceptional performers will deviate from these norms. Rebecca shifted her gaze to meet Dr. Hoffman's eyes directly. The question isn't whether I fit the expected psychological profile of a fighter pilot. The question is whether the expected psychological profile is optimal for combat effectiveness. Dr. Hoffman made several notes, her pen moving quickly across the evaluation form. Your commanding officer is concerned about your ability to integrate with your squadron. How do you respond to that? Integration requires mutual adaptation. My squadron mates have made no effort to understand my methods or capabilities. They have simply rejected what they don't recognize as familiar. But don't you have some responsibility to adapt to them? For the first time, Rebecca smiled. A call to the thin, precise expression that didn't reach her eyes. Dr. Hoffman, if you were evaluating a Formula One driver, would you expect them to drive like a Sunday commuter? Or would you expect the team to learn how to work with exceptional capability? The comparison was so unexpected that Dr. Hoffman paused her note-taking. Are you comparing yourself to a Formula One driver? I'm comparing my cognitive processing under stress to any other specialized human capability that deviates from normal parameters. My question is whether the military values optimization or conformity. Dr. Hoffman spent the next 2 hours trying to find cracks in Rebecca's psychological armor. She probed for signs of antisocial tendencies, narcissistic traits, inability to form attachments, or other red flags that might justify the concerns raised by Colonel Barrett. Instead, she found something unprecedented: a person who had systematically analyzed her own psychological makeup and developed a comprehensive understanding of how her unusual neurology affected her performance and social interactions. Dr. Hoffman, Rebecca said during a brief pause in the questioning, may I ask you something? Of course. In your professional experience, what percentage of psychological evaluations result in the discovery that the subject's unusual traits are actually advantageous for their assigned role? Dr. Hoffman considered the question carefully. That's actually quite rare. Most evaluations are triggered by performance problems or behavioral issues. Exactly. This evaluation was triggered by exceptional performance coupled with non-standard social integration. The underlying assumption is that deviation from psychological norms indicates pathology rather than adaptation. After the evaluation concluded, Dr. Hoffman sat alone in her office, staring at her notes. In 20 years of military psychological evaluations, she had never encountered a subject who understood their own psychology better than she did. Rebecca Davis wasn't suffering from any disorder. She was operating on a completely different level of cognitive function. Dr. Hoffman's preliminary report would shake the foundation of everything Colonel Barrett believed about his unusual pilot. Meanwhile, Rebecca had begun her own investigation. That evening, she accessed the base's digital library and began researching military aviation psychology, squadron integration protocols, and most importantly, the legal protections available to service members facing discrimination based on neurological differences. What she discovered was remarkable. Buried in recent updates to military personnel regulations was a directive that specifically protected service members whose atypical neurological processing patterns contributed to exceptional performance capabilities. The regulation had been implemented after several incidents where highly capable personnel had been discharged due to misunderstanding of their cognitive differences. But the real revelation came when Rebecca cross-referenced her situation with similar cases from other air bases. She wasn't alone. There was a pattern of exceptional pilots being sidelined or removed from service because their unusual capabilities made commanding officers uncomfortable. Santos found her in the base library at nearly midnight, surrounded by printouts and legal documents. Rebecca, what are you doing here so late? She looked up, her dark eyes bright with the intensity of discovery. Research. Santos, did you know that in the past 5 years, 17 pilots with performance profiles similar to mine have been discharged or transferred to non-combat roles? Santos pulled up a chair beside her. What do you mean, similar profiles? Exceptional technical capabilities, unusual stress responses, difficulty with social integration. All of them were characterized as psychological risks by their commanding officers. Rebecca spread several documents across the table. But here's what's interesting: follow-up studies showed that when these pilots were transferred to specialized units that understood their capabilities, their performance exceeded every metric used to measure combat effectiveness. You think Barrett is making the same mistake? I think Barrett is operating from a playbook that assumes deviation from psychological norms indicates instability. But what if the opposite is true? What if some deviations indicate evolution? Santos studied the documents, his experienced eye catching the implications immediately. Rebecca, this could change everything. If you can prove systematic discrimination, double quotes, I can do more than prove it. I can demonstrate that the current evaluation criteria are fundamentally flawed. Rebecca pulled out her tablet and showed Santos her analysis. Look at the combat effectiveness data from squadrons that have integrated atypical pilots versus those operating with standard psychological profiles. The difference in mission success rates is statistically significant. How? Did you get access to this data? It's all publicly available through military research databases. No one bothers to correlate it because the assumption is that standard profiles represent optimal performance. Santos leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. Rebecca, if this is accurate, it means the military has been systematically removing some of its most capable personnel. Exactly. And it means that my situation isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of institutional bias against cognitive diversity. Over the next 3 days, while waiting for Dr. Hoffman's evaluation results, Rebecca compiled a comprehensive report documenting her research. She cross-referenced performance data, legal precedents, and psychological studies to build an ironclad case that her treatment represented not just poor judgment, but potentially illegal discrimination. The breakthrough came when she discovered that Edwards Air Force Base had been selected as a test site for new squadron integration protocols specifically designed to accommodate pilots with atypical psychological profiles. The program had been approved 6 months ago, but never implemented due to command resistance. Rebecca realized she had stumbled upon something much larger than her personal situation. There was a battle being fought at the highest levels of military aviation between traditionalists who valued conformity and progressives who recognized that modern combat required cognitive capabilities that didn't fit standard psychological profiles. She also discovered something else. Colonel Barrett had been specifically briefed on the new integration protocols and had been expected to implement them. His failure to do so and his treatment of Rebecca represented a direct violation of updated military guidelines. Armed with this information, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to wait passively for Dr. Hoffman's evaluation or Barrett's judgment. She was going to take control of her situation. Late Thursday evening, Rebecca sent a detailed report to the Inspector General's office, documenting not just her own treatment but the systematic pattern of discrimination against cognitively atypical pilots. She included her research data, legal analysis, and a formal complaint alleging violations of updated military personnel regulations. But she didn't stop there. Rebecca also sent copies to the Pentagon's office responsible for aviation innovation, the Congressional Committee overseeing military personnel policies, and the research division that had originally recommended the new integration protocols. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Edwards Air Force Base. Colonel Patricia Martinez from the Inspector General's office arrived unannounced, requesting immediate meetings with Colonel Barrett, Dr. Hoffman, and Lieutenant Rebecca Davis. Barrett's confidence began to waver when he learned about the IG investigation. His certainty that Rebecca was a problem to be eliminated suddenly looked like a potential career-ending mistake. Colonel Barrett, Martinez said during their private meeting, I need you to explain why Lieutenant Davis has been subjected to psychological evaluation and potential disciplinary action despite having the highest performance scores in her squadron. Barrett fumbled through his justifications, citing concerns about team integration and unpredictable behavior. But under Martinez's questioning, his arguments began to sound increasingly weak. Colonel, are you aware that Lieutenant Davis' psychological Profile matches patterns identified in the Pentagon's recent study on cognitively exceptional pilots? Barrett's face went pale. What study? The study that recommended specific integration protocols for pilots, exhibiting atypical stress responses and exceptional cognitive capabilities. The study that led to updated personnel regulations. 6 months ago. The study that specifically identified pilots like Lieutenant Davis as high-value assets requiring specialized management approaches. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Barrett realizing that his treatment of Rebecca hadn't just been wrong. It had been a direct violation of policies he should have implemented months ago. Dr. Hoffman's evaluation, when it finally arrived, was even more damaging to Barrett's position. Her report concluded that Rebecca exhibited no psychological pathology whatsoever. Instead, she recommended that Rebecca be studied as an example of optimal cognitive adaptation to high-stress environments. But the most significant development came that afternoon. Rebecca received a call from General Patricia Hawkins, the Pentagon's Director of Aviation Innovation. Lieutenant Davis, your report has generated considerable interest at the highest levels. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to participate in a new program, specifically designed for pilots with exceptional cognitive capabilities. Rebecca listened as General Hawkins described a classified unit that operated with pilots who had been systematically misunderstood by traditional command structures. The unit's mission success rate was unprecedented, their casualties minimal, and their methods revolutionary. The position would mean immediate promotion to captain and transfer to a squadron that understands and values your particular capabilities. Interested? For the first time since arriving at Edwards, Rebecca allowed herself a genuine smile. Yes, ma'am. Very interested. As word of the IG investigation and Rebecca's pending transfer spread through the squadron, the atmosphere began to shift dramatically. Jackson, who had been so vocal in his criticism, now found himself facing questions about his role in what was beginning to look like systematic harassment of an exceptional pilot. Santos approached Rebecca in the mess hall that evening, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "You did this," he said quietly. "You turned the entire situation around." Rebecca looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had unnerved so many of her squadronmates. "I simply provided accurate information to the appropriate authorities. The system responded logically to factual data. Is that how you see everything, as systems responding to data?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I see patterns, Santos. I always have." The pattern here was clear institutional bias, masquerading as professional judgment. Once I documented the pattern, the correction was inevitable. And Barrett? Colonel Barrett operated according to his training and experience. His error was in assuming that deviation from familiar patterns indicated malfunction rather than evolution. Santos shook his head, marveling at her clinical assessment of the situation. "You're not angry? After everything they put you through?" "Anger is inefficient," Rebecca replied. "Adaptation is optimal." As she spoke, Rebecca realized something important had changed. For the first time since arriving at Edwards, she felt understood, not by her squadron mates perhaps, but by a system that was finally beginning to recognize that the future of military aviation might require cognitive capabilities that looked nothing like the past. The fight back had begun with research and evidence, but Rebecca was beginning to understand that true change would require something more, a demonstration of what was possible when exceptional capabilities were properly understood and strategically deployed. That opportunity was coming sooner than anyone expected. The emergency klaxon shattered the Monday morning calm at Edwards Air Force Base at exactly 0347 hours. Within minutes, pilots were scrambling from their quarters, the urgent tone indicating this was no drill. Rebecca, already awake and reviewing flight manuals in her quarters, was dressed and heading to the briefing room before most of her squadron mates had processed what was happening. The briefing room buzzed with tense energy as Colonel Barrett entered, his face grim with the weight of breaking news. Behind him, the main display showed satellite imagery of a crisis unfolding in real time. "People, we have a situation," Barrett announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. 12 hours ago, a commercial airliner with 247 passengers and crew suffered catastrophic system failures over hostile territory. The aircraft made an emergency landing in a valley approximately 40 miles inside enemy-controlled airspace. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A rescue mission deep in enemy territory meant significant risk, complex planning, and the kind of combat flying that separated exceptional pilots from good ones. Captain Rivera stepped forward with the tactical briefing. "Intelligence confirms. The aircraft is intact and survivors are verified. However, enemy forces are converging on the crash site. We have a narrow window, perhaps 6 hours before the situation becomes untenable." Barrett's eyes swept the room, noting Rebecca's presence but deliberately avoiding eye contact. "This mission requires our most experienced pilots. Alpha and Bravo teams will execute the rescue operation. Charlie team will provide tactical support from defensive positions." Rebecca felt the familiar sting of exclusion, but this time it carried deeper significance. Lives hung in the balance, and she was being sidelined not for tactical reasons but because of Barrett's personal discomfort with her capabilities. Jackson raised his hand. "Sir, what's the enemy strength in the target area?" "Significant," Rivera replied grimly. "Surface-to-air missiles, coordinated air defenses, and mobile units. This is going to be the most dangerous mission this squadron has faced." Rebecca stood slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. "Colonel Barrett, I request permission to volunteer for the rescue mission." The silence that followed was deafening. Barrett's jaw tightened visibly. "Lieutenant Davis, you are not qualified for this type of operation." "With respect, sir, my qualification scores exceed those of every pilot assigned to this mission." "Qualification scores don't measure judgment under pressure or the ability to make life-and-death decisions for civilian lives." Rebecca's voice remained perfectly calm, but something in her tone commanded attention. "Sir, 247 people are depending on this squadron's ability to execute a complex rescue under hostile conditions. Personal opinions about my social integration should not factor into operational decisions." Barrett's face darkened. "Lieutenant, you are out of line. Your psychological evaluation hasn't even been—" "Colonel Barrett," interrupted a new voice from the back of the room. Colonel Patricia Martinez from the Inspector General's office stepped forward, having arrived unannounced during the briefing. "I need to speak with you immediately." The tension in the room ratcheted up another level. EG investigations were serious business, and Martinez's presence during an emergency mission briefing was unprecedented. "Colonel Martinez, we're in the middle of critical mission planning, which is exactly why this conversation can't wait." Martinez's tone brooked no argument. "Conference room now." As Barrett reluctantly followed Martinez out, the briefing room erupted in whispered conversations. Rebecca remained standing, her expression unchanged, but her mind racing through tactical calculations. Santos approached her. "Rebecca, what's happening with the IG investigation?" "Colonel Martinez is conducting a formal review of squadron management practices, specifically regarding the treatment of pilots with atypical psychological profiles." "Does Barrett know about your complaint?" "He will shortly." In the conference room, Colonel Martinez wasted no time with pleasantries. "Colonel Barrett, I'm here investigating formal complaints about your treatment of Lieutenant Davis, but given the current emergency, I need to address something immediately." She placed a thick folder on the table. Dr. Hoffman's psychological evaluation of Lieutenant Davis has been reviewed by Pentagon specialists. Their conclusion is unequivocal. Lieutenant Davis exhibits optimal psychological adaptation for high-stress combat operations. Barrett stared at the folder. I don't understand. Her behavior patterns indicate cognitive processing capabilities that exceed normal human parameters under stress. In layman's terms, Colonel, she gets better when things get worse. Martinez opened the folder, revealing charts and analysis that painted Rebecca's psychological profile in an entirely different light. The specialists recommend that Lieutenant Davis be immediately reassigned to missions that can utilize her exceptional capabilities. Colonel Martinez, I have serious concerns about her ability to function as part of the team. Colonel Barrett, let me be clear. Your concerns appear to be based on personal discomfort rather than professional assessment. And right now, you have 247 civilians whose lives may depend on utilizing every available asset. Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious. I'm not ordering you to assign Lieutenant Davis to this mission, but I am informing you that excluding her for non-performance reasons could constitute dereliction of duty. Barrett felt the walls closing in. His certainty about Rebecca being a problem was collapsing under the weight of official scrutiny, and now he faced the prospect of explaining why he hadn't used his most capable pilot for the most critical mission of his command. When they returned to the briefing room, the atmosphere had shifted. Word of the IG investigation had spread, and pilots were beginning to question assumptions they'd held for months. Lieutenant Foster approached Rebecca hesitantly. Davis, is it true that your psych eval came back clean? Dr. Hoffman's evaluation concluded that my psychological profile is optimal for combat operations. Rebecca replied precisely. Jackson, overhearing, felt a chill of realization. His campaign against Rebecca suddenly looked less like justified concern and more like harassment of an exceptional pilot. Colonel Barrett resumed his position at the front of the room, his confidence visibly shaken. Mission planning continues as assigned, dismissed. But as pilots filed out to prepare for the rescue operation, Santos remained behind with Rebecca. Colonel, Santos said, his voice carrying the authority of his experience, I formally request that Lieutenant Davis be added to the rescue mission roster. Barrett turned, his expression strained. Captain Santos, my decision stands. Sir, with respect, this isn't about personalities or comfort levels. This is about capability under fire. And frankly, if this mission goes wrong, you're going to have to explain why you left your best pilot on the ground. Other pilots began to pause in their exit, listening to the exchange. Rebecca noticed Jackson among them, his expression troubled. Captain Santos, I appreciate your confidence in Lieutenant Davis, but, Colonel, Jackson interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Maybe Santos has a point. I mean, if the IG is investigating our treatment of Davis, and if her psych eval really came back clean. Barrett stared at Jackson, shocked by the reversal from his most vocal critic. Lieutenant Jackson, your previous concerns were maybe based on not understanding what I was seeing, Jackson admitted, avoiding Rebecca's eyes. Look, I still don't get how she stays so calm, but if the experts are saying that's actually a good thing ... The room had gone completely quiet. Rebecca watched the dynamic shift with the same analytical precision she applied to everything else. Fear was giving way to understanding, suspicion to reluctant respect. Colonel Martinez, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped forward. Colonel Barrett, I have one more piece of information that might influence your decision. She handed him a classified folder. Intelligence update, received 20 minutes ago. The rescue zone is more heavily defended than initially assessed. This mission now requires pilots capable of optimal performance under extreme stress. Barrett opened the folder, his face growing pale as he read the updated threat assessment. The mission had evolved from dangerous to nearly suicidal. It would require precision, split-second decision-making, and the kind of cold, calculating courage that few pilots possessed. He looked up at Rebecca, seeing her perhaps for the first time not as a problem to be managed, but as a resource to be utilized. "Lieutenant Davis," he said quietly, "are you prepared to risk your life for 247 civilians you've never met?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Colonel, I've been prepared for that since the day I became a pilot. The question is whether you're prepared to let me." Barrett felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders. Every instinct told him to stick with familiar pilots, predictable responses, the comfort of known quantities. But the evidence was mounting that his instincts might be fundamentally wrong about what made a pilot exceptional. "Report to Alpha Team for mission briefing," he said finally. "Lieutenant Jackson will brief you on the tactical situation." As Rebecca moved toward the Alpha Team's planning area, she passed Colonel Martinez, who nodded approvingly. "Lieutenant," Martinez said quietly, "this is your chance to prove that exceptional capabilities deserve exceptional opportunities." Rebecca nodded once, her expression unchanged but her eyes carrying a new intensity. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." What none of them knew was that the rescue mission would become more than just a test of Rebecca's abilities. It would become a defining moment that would reshape everyone's understanding of what was possible when exceptional cognitive capabilities were properly deployed under impossible conditions. The downfall of the old assumptions about Lieutenant Rebecca Davis was about to begin in earnest. The rescue mission briefing was unlike anything Edwards Air Force Base had ever conducted. 6 pilots gathered around a holographic display showing the crash site in devastating detail. A commercial airliner broken in half across a narrow valley, surrounded by increasing enemy forces and time running out for 247 innocent lives. "The situation has deteriorated since initial assessment," Captain Rivera announced grimly. "Enemy forces have positioned surface-to-air missile batteries at 3 points around the valley. Mobile units are converging from the north and south. Our window of opportunity is closing rapidly." Lieutenant Rebecca Davis stood among the Alpha Team pilots, her presence creating an unusual dynamic. Jackson kept glancing at her with an expression mixing wariness and something that might have been respect. Santos watched protectively, while the other pilots, Foster and Williams, seemed unsure how to process her inclusion in what everyone knew was a suicide mission. "The rescue plan is complex," Rivera continued. "Alpha 1 and 2 will create a distraction attack on the northern missile sites. Alpha 3 and 4 will escort the rescue helicopters to the crash site. Alpha 5 and 6 will provide air cover and tactical coordination." He paused, looking directly at Rebecca. "Lieutenant Davis, you'll be Alpha 6 tactical coordinator. Your job is to monitor the entire operation and provide real-time threat assessment." Rebecca nodded once. "Understood. What are the rules of engagement for civilian protection?" "Absolute priority on civilian safety. No unnecessary risks with passenger lives." "Define parameters for unnecessary risks?" The question caught Rivera off guard. Most pilots would focus on their own survival. Rebecca was already calculating acceptable risk levels for optimal civilian protection. "Use your judgment, Lieutenant." Rebecca's expression remained unchanged, but something in her eyes suggested she was processing far more complex calculations than anyone else in the room. "Acknowledged." Colonel Barrett entered the briefing room, his face drawn with the weight of command decisions. "Final intelligence update," he announced. "Enemy reinforcements are arriving faster than anticipated. This mission launches in 30 minutes, or we abort and leave those civilians to their fate." The room fell silent. 30 minutes to save 247 lives, with odds stacked impossibly against them. "Sir," Jackson said, his voice tight with stress, "those SAM sites will track us the moment we enter the valley. Standard approach patterns put us in a kill zone." Barrett nodded grimly. "I know. That's why we're going anyway. Sometimes impossible missions are the only option." Rebecca stepped forward, her movement fluid and precise. "Colonel, I've analyzed the tactical data. There's an approach vector that could work." Barrett turned to her, desperation overriding his usual reluctance to trust her judgment. "Explain." Rebecca moved to the holographic display, her fingers dancing across the controls with startling speed. The image shifted, showing the valley from multiple angles as she highlighted specific terrain features. "The enemy SAM positions are optimized for standard attack patterns," she explained, her voice calm despite the urgency surrounding them. "But there's a thermal inversion layer at approximately 500 feet above the valley floor. Combined with the morning sun angle, we can use atmospheric distortion to mask our approach." She traced a complex flight path through the display. "The approach requires precise timing and coordination, but it exploits a 15-second window where their targeting systems will be degraded." Santos studied the proposed route, his experienced eyes catching details others missed. "Rebecca, that flight pattern, it's beyond human reaction time to execute with the precision required." Rebecca turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting an intensity none of them had seen before. "Not beyond mine." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about human limitations. Barrett stared at her, recognizing something he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Rebecca Davis wasn't just different. She was operating on a level that redefined what was possible. "Can you guarantee execution of that flight path?" Barrett asked. "I can guarantee optimal probability of mission success within acceptable risk parameters for civilian protection." Barrett made the decision that would define his career. "We go with Lieutenant Davis's plan. All teams, prepare for immediate departure." 30 minutes later, 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons lifted off from Edwards, their formation precise as they climbed toward the morning sun. Rebecca flew in the Alpha 6 position, her aircraft slightly elevated to provide optimal oversight of the tactical situation. As they approached the contested airspace, the radio chatter began tense. Focused communications between pilots whose lives depended on split-second coordination. "Alpha Team, you are entering hostile airspace," came the voice from base control. "Enemy activity is increasing around the target zone." "Copy, Control," Jackson responded from Alpha 1. "Beginning approach to northern distraction targets." Rebecca's voice cut through the communication clearly, her tone carrying none of the stress evident in the others. "Alpha 6 to all teams. Initiating tactical coordination protocol. All aircraft maintain current altitude until mark." On her instruments, Rebecca could see the enemy SAM sites powering up, their targeting radars sweeping the sky in deadly arcs. Most pilots would focus on evasion, on survival. Rebecca saw patterns, opportunities, the mathematical precision of a chess game played at supersonic speeds. "Alpha 6 to base," she transmitted. "Enemy SAM batteries are using coordinated tracking. Recommend immediate implementation of atmospheric masking approach." Barrett's voice crackled through from base control. "Alpha 6, you have tactical command. Execute your plan." What happened next would be studied in military academies for years to come. Rebecca's voice became the calm center of chaos, directing 6 aircraft through a 3-dimensional ballet of precision that exploited every weakness in the enemy's defensive screen. "Alpha 1, bank 30 degrees left and drop to 400 feet. Mark. Alpha 2, follow Alpha 1's trail exactly. Deviation of more than 10 feet will compromise the thermal masking." Jackson, following Rebecca's directions, found himself flying lower and more precisely than he'd ever attempted. In combat, Alpha 6, these instructions are beyond normal flight parameters. Execute exactly as directed, Alpha 1. Trust the mathematics. As the formation descended into the valley, Rebecca's predictions proved startlingly accurate. The atmospheric distortion combined with their precise positioning created a blind spot in the enemy's targeting systems, exactly as she had calculated. But the real test came when things went wrong. Alpha 6, this is Alpha 3, came Foster's urgent voice. I'm picking up additional SAM sites not shown in intelligence. We're flying into a trap. Rebecca's response was immediate and calm. Alpha 3, confirm coordinates of new threats. The grid 774, approximately 2 miles south of the crash site. In the seconds that followed, Rebecca's mind processed tactical data at inhuman speed. Wind patterns, fuel consumption, ammunition loads, civilian positions, enemy capabilities, all of it synthesized into a new plan that accounted for variables no one else had even identified. All teams, new mission profile, Rebecca announced. Alpha 1 and 2 continue distraction attack as planned. Alpha 3, you're going to draw fire from the new SAM sites, while Alpha 4 executes rescue at the crash site. Alpha 5 provides cover, and I neutralize the southern batteries. Alpha 6, Santos interjected from Alpha 5. That puts you alone against multiple SAM sites. It's suicide. Rebecca's voice remained steady. Negative, Alpha 5. It's optimization. What followed defied everything the other pilots thought they understood about combat flying. Rebecca's aircraft dove toward the valley floor with impossible precision, using terrain features and atmospheric conditions to mask her approach. Her first missile strike took out the command center coordinating the SAM sites, immediately degrading their effectiveness. My God, Williams whispered from Alpha 4 as he watched Rebecca's tactical display. She's flying like she can see the future. Rebecca's second and third attacks created a corridor of opportunity for the rescue helicopters, which had been waiting at the valley's edge. As enemy forces scrambled to respond to her assault, the other Alpha team pilots executed their assigned roles with a precision enabled by her tactical coordination. Alpha 6 to rescue teams, Rebecca transmitted, her voice calm despite flying through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Window is open. Execute rescue now. The helicopter pilots, veteran rescue specialists, later said they'd never seen anything like Rebecca's tactical management. She anticipated enemy movements before they happened, countered threats before they fully developed, and maintained situational awareness across the entire battle space while engaged in combat herself. Alpha 6, Barrett's voice came through. From base, tight with stress. Status report. 247 civilians extracted successfully, Rebecca replied, her aircraft now climbing away from the valley as the last rescue helicopter cleared the crash site. Mission parameters achieved within acceptable loss criteria. Acceptable loss criteria? Barrett asked. What losses? None, sir. All aircraft returning to base. All civilians recovered. Enemy capabilities in target zone neutralized. The silence that followed was profound. An impossible mission had been executed flawlessly under the tactical command of the pilot. Barrett had been ready to discharge just days earlier. As the formation returned to Edwards, Jackson's voice broke the odd quiet. Alpha 6... Rebecca... How did you do that? How did you see moves the enemy hadn't even made yet? Rebecca's response came with her characteristic precision, but for the first time, there was something approaching warmth in her tone. Pattern. Recognition, Alpha 1. When you process information without emotional interference, solutions become apparent. Santos, flying alongside her, saw something on Rebecca's face through her cockpit camera feed that he'd never seen before. Not quite a smile, but a satisfaction that seemed almost human. Landing at Edwards felt like returning to a different world. The impossible had been achieved, lives had been saved, and Lieutenant Rebecca Davis had proven that her unusual capabilities weren't a liability. They were exactly what exceptional circumstances required. As the pilots climbed down from their aircraft, Rebecca found herself surrounded not by the usual isolation, but by squadron mates who finally understood what they had been witnessing all along. Colonel Barrett approached, his expression mixing relief, amazement, and something that looked like humility. "Lieutenant Davis," he said formally, "your tactical command was unprecedented." Rebecca stood at attention, but there was something different in her posture. Not the rigid perfection of someone trying to fit in, but the natural confidence of someone who had finally been allowed to be themselves. "Thank you, sir." The mission success was achieved through proper utilization of available assets. Barrett nodded slowly, understanding that her clinical language masked something profound. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you the opportunity to reach your full potential." For the first time since arriving at Edwards, Rebecca allowed herself a genuine expression of emotion, a slight nod that acknowledged not just his words, but the complete transformation of their professional relationship. The climax had passed, but its reverberations would reshape everything that followed. The debriefing room was packed beyond capacity. What should have been a standard mission review had evolved into something approaching a military legend in the making. Officers from other squadrons, senior command staff, and even personnel from the Pentagon had arrived to witness the aftermath of what was already being called the impossible rescue. Lieutenant Rebecca Davis sat at the center of it all, her posture as composed as ever, but something fundamental had changed. The nervous energy that had always surrounded her presence was gone, replaced by a kind of respectful attention that she had never experienced before. Colonel Barrett stood at the front of the room, holding a folder thick with preliminary reports and commendations. His transformation was as remarkable as Rebecca's. The rigid commander, who had viewed her as a problem, now spoke with the careful respect of someone who recognized exceptional capability. "Ladies and gentlemen," Barrett began, "yesterday's mission represents perhaps the most successful combat rescue operation in this base's history. 247 civilians were extracted from hostile territory with 0 casualties and minimal resource expenditure." He turned toward Rebecca. "This success was achieved through tactical innovation that redefined our understanding of combat coordination under extreme circumstances." General Patricia Hawkins, who had flown in from the Pentagon specifically for this debriefing, stepped forward. Her presence elevated the significance of the moment. 4-star generals didn't attend squadron debriefings unless something extraordinary had occurred. "Lieutenant Davis," General Hawkins said, "walk us through your tactical decision-making process during the rescue operation." Rebecca stood, her movement fluid and confident. As she approached the main display, the room fell silent with the kind of attention reserved for true expertise. The initial mission parameters indicated a low-probability scenario with high civilian risk, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Standard tactical approaches would have resulted in either mission failure or unacceptable casualties. She activated the holographic display, showing the valley where the rescue had taken place. The solution required integration of atmospheric conditions, enemy psychology, and optimal resource allocation in real time. For the next hour, Rebecca walked the assembled officers through her methodology. But this time, her explanations weren't met with uncomfortable silence or skeptical glances. Instead, seasoned combat veterans leaned forward, taking notes, asking detailed questions about techniques that pushed the boundaries of what they thought possible. Lieutenant Jackson, who had spent months undermining Rebecca's credibility, raised his hand. Lieutenant Davis, during the mission, you seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened. How is that possible? Rebecca considered the question carefully. Pattern recognition operates faster than conscious thought when emotional. Interference is minimized. Enemy behavior follows predictable patterns based on training, equipment limitations, and tactical doctrine. When you process these variables without anxiety or ego involvement, responses become apparent before they're fully executed. Major Williams from Beta Squadron spoke up. Are you saying that staying calm gives you predictive capabilities? I'm saying that optimal cognitive function under stress allows for data processing that appears predictive, but is actually analytical. General Hawkins smiled, the first time anyone in the room had seen her display any emotion. Lieutenant, that's the most elegant description of combat intuition I've heard in 30 years of military service. Captain Santos, who had supported Rebecca from the beginning, felt a deep satisfaction watching the transformation around him. General, with respect, Lieutenant Davis has been demonstrating these capabilities for months. We just didn't understand what we were seeing. That's exactly the point, Captain, General Hawkins replied. The military has been systematically failing to recognize and properly utilize cognitive capabilities that don't fit standard psychological profiles. She turned to address the entire room. What happened yesterday isn't just a successful rescue mission. It's proof that our traditional approaches to evaluating pilot capabilities are fundamentally flawed. Colonel Martinez from the Inspector General's office, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. General Hawkins, Lieutenant Davis's case represents a pattern we've identified across multiple bases. Exceptional pilots being sidelined because their capabilities were misunderstood as psychological problems. Barrett shifted uncomfortably, understanding that his treatment of Rebecca was part of a larger institutional failure. Colonel Martinez, in my defense, Lieutenant Davis's behavior patterns were unlike anything in my experience. Colonel Barrett, Rebecca said quietly, that's exactly the point. Evolution in human capability will always appear abnormal until it becomes the new standard. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just discussing one pilot's vindication. They were witnessing a paradigm shift in how the military understood exceptional human performance. General Hawkins opened a folder she'd been carrying. Lieutenant Davis, based on your performance and the recommendations from multiple sources, I'm authorized to offer you immediate promotion to captain, an assignment to a specialized unit that operates with pilots exhibiting atypical cognitive capabilities. Rebecca remained standing at attention, but something in her expression suggested she was processing more than just a promotion offer. General, what would be the mission parameters for this specialized unit? Operations that conventional pilots cannot execute. Missions requiring capabilities that push the boundaries of human performance. The kind of assignments where your particular cognitive processing patterns would be strategic advantages rather than social inconveniences. For the first time since the briefing began, Rebecca allowed herself a slight smile. I accept, General. The room erupted in applause, something unprecedented in a military debriefing. Even the most senior officers, who had witnessed decades of exceptional service, recognized they were seeing something extraordinary. Lieutenant Foster, who had flown Alpha 3 during the rescue mission, stood up. General Hawkins, ma'am, I'd like to formally request that my previous statements about Lieutenant Captain Davis be stricken from the record. I was wrong about her capabilities. So was I, Jackson added, his voice carrying genuine regret. Captain Davis, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond words. I let my own insecurities make me see a problem where there was actually ... evolution. Rebecca turned to face Jackson, her expression thoughtful. Lieutenant Jackson, Your skepticism was logical based on available information. The error was systemic, not personal. That's generous, but it doesn't excuse the way I treated you. No, Rebecca agreed quietly, but understanding the source of the error prevents its repetition. That's more valuable than apologies. General Hawkins watched this exchange with obvious approval. This is exactly the kind of perspective we need. In the new program, Captain Davis, your assignment begins Monday. You'll be working with pilots who have been similarly misunderstood cognitive capabilities that were seen as liabilities until someone recognized their strategic value. Colonel Barrett stepped forward, his expression mixing humility with professional respect. General, I'd like to formally recommend Captain Davis for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Her tactical innovation yesterday saved 247 civilian lives and demonstrated combat capabilities that exceed anything in my command experience. Already in progress, Colonel. The paperwork was submitted while the mission was still ongoing. Rebecca blinked, the first sign of surprise anyone had seen from her. The recommendation was submitted during the mission? General Hawkins smiled. Captain, when someone coordinates a perfect rescue operation while simultaneously executing solo combat maneuvers that neutralize an entire enemy defensive network, the paperwork starts itself. Santos approached Rebecca as the formal debriefing concluded. I knew there was something special about you from the beginning. I just didn't understand what I was seeing. You saw what others missed, Santos. You recognize that difference doesn't automatically indicate dysfunction. So what happens now? You disappear into some classified unit where no one will understand what we lost. Rebecca considered this, her dark eyes reflecting something warmer than her usual analytical intensity. Santos, you didn't lose anything. You gained proof that exceptional capabilities exist and can be properly recognized. The next pilot like me who arrives here will have a very different experience because of what happened. Dr. Hoffman, who had conducted Rebecca's psychological evaluation, approached with a thick folder. Captain Davis, I wanted to show you something. Your evaluation results have been distributed to psychology departments at 3 major universities. You're going to be studied as an example of optimal cognitive adaptation to stress. Studied. How? As proof that what we consider psychological abnormalities might actually be evolutionary advantages. Your case is going to change how we evaluate exceptional human performance. Rebecca accepted the folder, scanning the research proposal. With her characteristic precision, this could help other pilots who process information differently. That's the point. You're not just getting recognition for your own capabilities. You're opening doors for others like you. As the crowd began to disperse, Colonel Barrett remained behind with Rebecca. The 2 officers who had been in fundamental conflict just days earlier now faced each other with mutual respect, born from shared understanding of what exceptional performance looked like. Captain Davis, Barrett said formally, I need to acknowledge something. My resistance to your capabilities wasn't based on your performance. It was based on my own limitations in recognizing excellence that didn't fit familiar patterns. Rebecca nodded once. Colonel Barrett, command requires making decisions with incomplete information. Your initial assessment was logical based on conventional training and experience, but wrong. Initially, yes, but capable of correction when presented. With better data, that's the mark of effective leadership. Barrett extended his hand. It's been an honor serving with you, Captain, even when I didn't understand what I was seeing. Rebecca shook his hand, her grip firm and confident. Thank you, Colonel, for eventually trusting me with the opportunity to prove my capabilities. That evening, Rebecca found herself in an unusual situation surrounded by squadron mates who wanted to understand her rather than avoid her. The mess hall conversation was different, marked by genuine curiosity rather than uncomfortable tolerance. Rebecca, Williams asked, What's it like to process information the way you do? Can you teach any of it? Rebecca considered the question while methodically eating her dinner. The cognitive patterns are largely neurological, but the principles can be learned. Emotional detachment during crisis situations, pattern recognition, over-assumption-based responses, optimal resource allocation rather than conventional tactics. Jackson leaned forward. Would you be willing to work with us before you transfer? I mean, if there are techniques that could make us better pilots, I would be happy to share what I know, Rebecca replied. Though the most important lesson isn't technical, what is it? Rebecca looked around the table at faces that had once viewed her with suspicion and now showed genuine respect. Excellence that looks different isn't necessarily wrong. It might be evolution. Foster nodded thoughtfully. So when the next pilot shows up who doesn't fit our expectations, you evaluate their capabilities rather than their conformity to familiar patterns. Santos, who had been quietly observing the conversation, smiled with deep satisfaction. You know what I think? I think you're going to change more than just this squadron. You're going to change how the entire military thinks about exceptional human performance. Rebecca allowed herself another of her rare, precise smiles. That's the hope, Santos. Systems that adapt to excellence perform better than systems that force excellence to adapt to them. As the evening wound down and pilots began heading to their quarters, Rebecca realized something remarkable had happened. For the first time since arriving at Edwards Air Force Base, she wasn't alone. She was understood, valued, and recognized for exactly what she was, not in spite of her differences, but because of them. Monday would bring her transfer to the specialized unit, a new chapter where her exceptional capabilities would be strategic advantages rather than social obstacles. But tonight, she was surrounded by colleagues who finally understood that the future of military aviation might require cognitive capabilities that looked nothing like the past. The recognition was complete, but Rebecca understood that this was just the beginning. She was about to join a program that would prove exceptional pilots weren't anomalies to be managed. They were evolutionary advantages to be cultivated. 6 months later, Captain Rebecca Davis returned to Edwards Air Force Base for a ceremony that would define the future of military aviation. The Distinguished Flying Cross presentation had evolved into something much larger, a formal recognition of the new Cognitive Diversity Initiative, with Rebecca as its first success story and primary advocate. The base looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. As Rebecca walked across the tarmac in her crisp dress uniform, now bearing captain's bars and a collection of ribbons that told the story of her extraordinary service record, she moved with the confident stride of someone who had found her true place in the world. The ceremony was held in the main hangar, transformed for the occasion with flags, podiums, and seating for over 300 attendees. Pilots from multiple squadrons, senior officers from across the service, and even congressional representatives had come to witness what was being called a paradigm shift in military personnel development. Santos, now promoted to major and serving as Rebecca's former squadron's commanding officer, spotted her as she entered. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he approached. "Rebecca, look at you, Pentagon's rising star." Rebecca's expression warmed in a way that would have been impossible during her first assignment at Edwards. "Major Santos, congratulations on your promotion. How's the squadron adapting to the new evaluation protocols?" "Better than anyone expected. We've got 3 pilots now who probably would have been sidelined under the old system. They're some of our best performers." "Pattern recognition instead of pattern conformity?" "Exactly. Your influence is still reshaping how we think about excellence." As they spoke, Colonel Barrett approached, his own uniform bearing the additional star that marked his recent promotion to Brigadier General. The transformation in his demeanor was as remarkable as Rebecca's, where once he had seemed threatened by her capabilities, He now carried himself with the confidence of a leader who had learned to recognize and cultivate exceptional talent. "Captain Davis," Barrett said formally, then smiled. "Rebecca, it's good to see you. Congratulations on your promotion, General Barrett. I understand Edwards has become a model base for cognitive diversity integration." Barrett nodded, his expression mixing pride with humility. "Largely due to what happened here with you. The techniques you shared before your transfer have been implemented across 3 air wings. Mission success rates are up 18%. And more importantly," Santos added, "pilot satisfaction and retention are at all-time highs. Turns out, people perform better when their unique capabilities are valued rather than viewed as problems to be corrected." Lieutenant Jackson, now Captain Jackson, and sporting his own collection of commendations, joined their conversation. The young pilot who had once been Rebecca's harshest critic now served as one of the base's primary advocates for recognizing atypical cognitive patterns. "Rebecca, I have to tell you something," Jackson said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "That conversation we had about fear and humanity, it changed how I think about everything. Not just flying, but leadership, teamwork, what excellence actually looks like." Rebecca studied his face, noting the maturity that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "You adapted your perspective based on new information. That's the mark of an exceptional pilot. I adapted because you showed me what was possible when someone operates without the limitations most of us place on ourselves." The ceremony began with General Hawkins taking the podium. Her presence had drawn national attention. The Pentagon's Director of Aviation Innovation, personally presenting awards, was unprecedented for anything less than historic significance. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawkins began, 6 months ago, a single pilot challenged everything we thought we knew about exceptional performance under pressure. Today, we're here to honor not just her individual achievements, but the transformation those achievements have sparked across our entire service." She gestured toward Rebecca, who stood at attention with 5 other pilots being honored. "Captain, Rebecca Davis didn't just execute a successful rescue mission. She proved that cognitive capabilities we had been systematically misunderstanding and underutilizing represent the future of military aviation excellence." The Distinguished Flying Cross presentation was formal, ceremonial, but the words that accompanied it carried weight beyond tradition. "For extraordinary heroism in aerial flight," General Hawkins read, "Captain Davis demonstrated tactical innovation and combat capability that redefined the parameters of possible mission success. Her actions saved 247 civilian lives and established new standards for cognitive excellence under extreme conditions." As the medal was pinned to Rebecca's uniform, she felt something she had rarely experienced: a sense of perfect alignment between who she was and how she was perceived by others. But the real significance came with General Hawkins' next announcement. "The success of Captain Davis and pilots like her has led to the establishment of the Cognitive Diversity Corps, a specialized division dedicated to identifying, training, and deploying personnel whose exceptional capabilities extend beyond traditional performance metrics." The audience erupted in applause, but Rebecca's attention was focused on the implications. What had begun as her personal struggle for acceptance had evolved into institutional change that would benefit countless others like her. After the ceremony, Dr. Hoffman approached with a research study that bore Rebecca's name on the cover. "I wanted you to see this," she said, handing over the document. "Your psychological profile has become the foundation for an entirely new category of pilot evaluation." Rebecca scanned the study, her precise mind quickly absorbing the key findings. "Optimal stress response patterns in high-performance personnel," she read aloud. "This suggests that atypical cognitive processing isn't an anomaly, it's an evolutionary advantage." "Exactly. We're now actively recruiting pilots who exhibit the same psychological patterns that would have gotten them rejected 6 months ago. How many? Currently, 47 pilots across 12 bases. But the program is expanding rapidly. Rebecca, you didn't just save your own career. You saved careers for people who haven't even enlisted yet. Later that evening, Rebecca found herself back in the mess hall where her journey at Edwards had begun. But instead of sitting alone, she was surrounded by current squadron members who peppered her with questions about advanced tactical theory, stress optimization, and cognitive enhancement techniques. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, a new pilot who had been recruited specifically because her psychological profile matched Rebecca's patterns, leaned forward with obvious admiration. Captain Davis, what advice would you give to someone who processes information differently than their squadron mates? Rebecca considered the question carefully. Understand that difference is not deficit. Your unique capabilities exist for a reason. The challenge is finding environments that recognize excellence regardless of how it manifests. But what if people don't understand you? Then educate them through demonstration rather than explanation. Performance speaks louder than words, and exceptional results eventually overcome initial skepticism. Foster, now a squadron leader herself, nodded approvingly. Rebecca is right. When we stopped trying to make her fit our expectations and started learning from her capabilities, everything changed. Not just for her, but for all of us. As the evening wound down, Santos found himself walking with Rebecca across the base, under a clear desert sky filled with stars. The same terrain where she had once felt isolated and misunderstood now felt like the launching point for a transformation that extended far beyond one base or one pilot. Any regrets? Santos asked. About how long it took for people to understand what you were. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her analytical mind processing the question with characteristic thoroughness. Regrets assume that different timing would have produced better outcomes. But the resistance I faced here created the evidence base that enabled institutional change. If recognition had come too easily, the lessons wouldn't have been comprehensive enough to reshape the entire system. So you're saying the struggle was necessary? I'm saying the struggle was educational. For me, for the squadron, for the service as a whole. Excellence that's never tested isn't really excellence. It's just untested potential. They paused near the flight line, where rows of F-16s sat silently under the desert stars. Rebecca looked at the aircraft with the same appreciation she'd always felt, but now it was unmarred by the isolation and frustration that had characterized her early months at Edwards. Santos, do you remember what you said to me that first day in the mess hall? About people fearing what they don't understand. I remember. You were right. But the corollary is equally important. Understanding eliminates fear and creates opportunity. The pilots recruited for the cognitive diversity course won't face the same challenges I did because the system now understands what to look for. Santos smiled, recognizing the profound satisfaction in her voice. You changed everything, Rebecca. Not just for yourself, but for everyone like you who'll come after. Rebecca nodded once, her characteristic precision now carrying warmth that would have been impossible during her early struggles. That was always the goal, Santos. Excellence should be recognized and cultivated regardless of how different it looks from expectations. As they headed back toward the base buildings, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The isolation, the misunderstanding, the systematic resistance to her capabilities, all of it had been necessary to create the evidence that exceptional cognitive capabilities deserved recognition rather than suspicion. The scared, isolated lieutenant who had arrived at Edwards 6 months earlier had evolved into Captain Rebecca Davis, advocate for cognitive diversity and proof that difference could be strength rather than liability. She had found her place. not by adapting to others' expectations, but by demonstrating the value of exceptional capabilities, properly understood and strategically deployed. The stillness that had once unnerved her squadron mates was now recognized as optimal preparation for impossible challenges. The calm that had seemed inhuman was understood as the foundation for human performance at its highest levels. And somewhere, in the desert night, under stars that had witnessed the birth of military aviation, Captain Rebecca Davis walked with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not just found her place in the world, but had expanded the world's understanding of what was possible when excellence was allowed to be exactly what it was. The story of the pilot who looked too calm to be real had become the story of how the future recognized and embraced the evolution of human capability. And for Rebecca Davis, that was exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.